Well, welcome back, friends, to episode 5 of the Bible according to Romans. And I want to talk today about the theme of Romans. And I want you to think about this question. If you only had one sermon you could preach, what would you preach? Or if you could address a receptive crowd in New York City, if you had 30 minutes to speak, what would you focus on? Or if you were going to write a final Facebook post or share one last message with your family, if you could go on the news and speak to a wide crowd, like what would you say? Or what would you say if you had nothing to lose? Well, so far in this series, we've looked at the historical purposes and the needs that caused Paul to write Romans. And we've introduced the idea that Romans tells a story about God fulfilling his covenantal purposes for his creation by sending Jesus Christ, the saving King. And what I want to do in this episode is consider the main theme that supplies much of the content Paul includes in this story. So what was Paul's one story he just had to tell? And what theme did he use to drive that story along? That's what we'll look at today. So as we mentioned in previous episodes, Romans is sometimes approached more generally as if it were a handbook of theology. And while we've tried to take a fuller approach to Romans, bringing in the historical background, the narrative shape of the book, nonetheless, there is a reason Romans lends itself so well to general theological studies. You look at the orderly way in which Paul lays out his argument, the time he takes to develop large ideas before applying them specifically. Well, that really gives us insight into some of the big ideas that controlled Paul's thinking. Almost like there are these theological ideas kind of under the surface, and they drove what we read on the surface in Romans. And especially in Romans, they tend to break through the surface, which is why, as I've said, the book lends itself so well to theological study. And so there's a sense in which that is very good and very helpful. Paul just, in Romans, lays out his thought, his argument, in a very orderly way. And as I said, develops the large ideas before applying them specifically. And so what this allows us to do is really get insight into some of the big ideas that controlled Paul's thinking and that he wanted to make sure he packaged in this book of Romans. And I'm not suggesting that, the ideas in Romans are more important than, say, the ideas in 1 Corinthians, as if we had a canon within the canon, so to speak. Rather, that Paul's strategy in Romans is to lay down the foundational ideas for Christianity. Just to give us some essential guidance in what constitutes Christianity and the gospel. And so that helps us very practically, by the way, because now Romans is giving us a blueprint for the central emphases of the Christian faith, showing us what we can emphasize in our message to the church and to the world. What our big story is, what our one message is as we promote Christian identity and Christian mission and Christian unity. And so that's why I want to conduct this discussion on the theme of Romans. What's the theological idea that Paul develops? What big idea drives his writing that aims to accomplish the specific pastoral, historical, narrative purposes we've discussed so far? What doctrine drives the story? What truths accomplish the purpose? That's what we want to consider in this discussion. And I think that we find the main answer to those questions in Romans 1, verses 16 and 17. Most commentators agree that these verses give us the theme of Romans. And so we read there in those verses, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's saving power for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. And if you were to read the verses that lead up to this statement, you would notice Paul describes himself as an apostle who is set apart for the gospel of God. We looked at that in the previous session. And then Paul goes on to say, and now look, because I'm all about bringing this gospel to the world and calling people to obey it, well, I want to come to Rome too. And I want to proclaim the gospel there. And why is Paul so eager to proclaim the gospel in Rome? Because, as he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It powerfully saves everyone who believes because it reveals the righteousness of God. And so it's on the basis of this passage, as well as the attention that Paul gives to the gospel in the opening paragraph, that many people argue that the gospel is the theme of Romans. That these are the theme verses because they give the initial kind of unpacking of the gospel and therefore show us what engine will drive this story. And commentators like Doug Moo have drawn attention to this theme and developed it in very helpful ways. While recognizing the importance of topics in Romans such as justification by faith and the unity of God's people, for Moo, the gospel is the overarching topic that is able to stand as the heading of Romans as a whole. And I think Moo is right, and I want to show then in this episode that the gospel is central. The gospel is the theme of Romans. The gospel provides the content for the story. And try to also show some of the practical relevance of that idea. So let's pursue that theme, that the gospel theme of Romans gives us a message for the church and for the world.